provides that we can only appropriate an amount which is 40% of the amount that was actually contributed by the public to the public broadcasting system 2 years previously. In other words, we are limited by the law in providing federal funds to 40% of the non-federal support. Now, my state, for instance, supports this public broadcasting to the tune of about $5 million. We do so because there are many areas in my state that have no daily news service, and it is the expansion of the public network, public radio, communication, television network that really is needed in unserved and underserved areas. Mention has been made that the administration may not be in support of this bill. I have before me the statement of administration policy that indicates that the administration supports Senate passage of this bill as reported by the committee and will work with the Congress to address the concerns. So none of those concerns indicate any lack of support for the appropriation in question. I am interested because what the senator does really with his amendment is to impose a freeze on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It will hurt individual stations, and it will harm the system altogether. It really amounts to rewriting the formula for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting because it suppresses the formula by not appropriating the monies to meet the increased public support and to meet the increased costs brought about by inflation. This system is heavily relied upon in the rural areas such as the rural portions of my state. Keep in mind, Mr. President, that state's 1/5 the size of the United States. It has a very limited series of public stations, and I'd ask to put in the record the effect of a freeze on federal appropriations to the stations in my state. And the Senate will see that the actual amount for 1996 will be substantially less than the amount that is being spent just this year if we follow the Senator from Arizona's approach and put a freeze on this spending.
Without
I'd ask this to be put in the record.
Included in the record.
Now, we believe that this system should support the Minority Consortium, the multicultural programming effort that is national in scope. It means a great deal to Alaska Natives, to the Indian communities throughout the country. Out of this Corporation for Public Broadcasting is paid 1/2 of the interconnection for public television. That also would suffer if the Senator's amendment is passed. We had a hard fight on the authorization. I hope that we will stay by this system. I know there's a lot of controversy about it. I remember some long discussions that I had out here on the floor with Senator Goldwater in the days that he was very, very specific about trying to urge this system to be fair and to be unbiased. But as a practical matter, what we're looking at now is trying to keep the federal government to the point where we promised we would go. We have promised that we would support the system to the extent of 40% of the non-federal support for this broadcasting system. And I hope that the Senate will maintain that. I oppose the Senator's amendment because I think that the CPB reauthorization bill that passed in the last Congress gave us a projection of funding that people have relied upon. And we ought to try to do our best to fund that. As the Senator from Hawaii has pointed out, the 320 mark is a long way from the authorization of $425 million. We have been fiscally responsible. We cut it a lot more than I would like to cut it, and I urge the defeat of the Senator's amendment.
The Senator is given an additional 5 minutes.
I have no desire. Thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona, Mr.
President, I, as always, paid close attention to the words of the Senator from Alaska, and I certainly appreciate his compelling words in behalf of Native Alaskans. I would, however, make one additional point, and that is that the Native Americans that I know were given a choice between being able to listen to public radio or have the very terribly underfunded programs concerning alcohol abuse, fetal alcohol syndrome, substance abuse, Indian education, and others. I think they would opt for additional funds to be spent in those very vital areas. I'd also like to point out, Mr. President, that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has been doing pretty well. From the information, the source is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, November 1992. In 1985, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting received $150 million. If my amendment is defeated, they'll have $320 million. And if it's not defeated, they will still have nearly doubled since 1985 to $292 million. Now, I understand the expanding need for the public broadcasting, but I would suggest that Corporation for Public Broadcasting has probably done better than most. And although I would be more than happy again to have a long discussion and debate about whether the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is really needed as much as it was many years ago when the American people had very few sources of information and news. In the case of television, 3 major networks was the source of their news. Now they can switch to one of many channels on their television station. When we talk about programs that are of educational and cultural interest, there are now on cable television many additional programs, A&E, Discovery Channel, others, which are not funded by the taxpayer. And again, if we were not facing a $4+ trillion debt and a multi-hundred-dollar a year annual deficit, Mr. President, I wouldn't be here with this amendment. But I've heard the message from the people that I represent, and they say they want us to cut spending. I'm not cutting spending with this amendment. I'm telling them to make do this year with the same amount of money as last year. I don't think that's an enormous sacrifice to be asked. So, especially, again, in light of the fact that in the view of many, other vital programs are underfunded. Other programs are being frozen. Some are even being cut. I'm very uneasy about the continued real reductions in defense spending. Real reductions, I might add, not cuts and increases in spending like we talk about the cuts of many other programs. I'm talking about real reductions. So, Mr. President, I would like to say that if we can't start by freezing, not cutting, but freezing the amount of money that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting received last year, keeping it that same level, I don't have a great deal of optimism about our ability to make the kind of spending cuts which will be necessary, indeed vital, for our nation's future. Sooner or later, as we all know, we're going to have to pay the national debt. Unfortunately, it may be our kids, but I frankly cannot justify the increase that is being sought in this bill by the Senate alone. Neither the other body nor the President of the United States has sought an increase. So I understand we have further speakers. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Senator from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Senator from Iowa, Mr. Harkin is recognized.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington, Mr. Gordon is recognized.
Mr. President, I want to take this opportunity briefly to express my reasons for opposing the amendment and to say that the brevity of my remarks is not a mark of my dedication to what I think is one of the most productive and cost-effective of all of the areas in which we spend. It is, of course, true that the people of the United States have many different opportunities with respect to both radio and radio and television broadcasting today. That does not mean that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is less important in the eyes of this senator, at least. It may very well mean that it is more important. Simply because it is not commercial, it carries with it the meaning that it will provide Americans with information of a type that they are unlikely, perhaps they will find it impossible to find such information on any of the commercial broadcasting stations. This is another field in which we very wisely forward fund. We are speaking about the amount of money to be available in the fiscal year 1996. We know that the cost of producing television programs goes up at some 8% a year. In other words, freezing appropriations for this purpose would amount to a very dramatic reduction. And yet at the same time, in the authorization bill which we passed last year, we called on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to create a system in which every American is served all across the country. That becomes increasingly expensive on a per-viewer basis as we go into rural parts of the country, but to have the availability of public broadcasting in those areas is especially significant. This is a case in which the people of the United States get a tremendous amount for their money. Only 15 or 16% of the cost of providing these programs comes from this appropriation, but it is a vital and a key 15 or 16% for the people of the United States. They have shown that they accept public broadcasting, that they like public broadcasting, that they can get from it information which is not otherwise available to them, and it has had, in the view of this senator, a wonderfully unifying impact on the people of the United States. The support increase, it seems to this senator, is relatively modest, and I urge my fellow senators to reject the amendment and to support the continued increase in the support for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which it has so richly earned.
We have time.
Mr. President, how much time remains?
Senator from Hawaii has 6 minutes and 30 seconds remaining.
I yield 6 minutes and 30 seconds to
I thank the senator for yielding.
Senator from Iowa is recognized.
I do not intend to take that much time. However, Mr. President, I do just want to make some comments in opposition to the amendment and in support of the committee mark. Our mark is $27 million over the House mark and the administration request for fiscal year 1996, and let's keep in mind we're talking about fiscal year 1996. Of this amount, $17 million is required just to maintain current services. And $10 million, as has been pointed out, is recommended to begin the Ready to Learn program. Now, keep in mind, Mr. President, that inflation in the communications industry is running very high, much higher than for other goods and services. And while federal funds represent only 16% of total public broadcasting revenues in this country, for rural and minority stations, the money we appropriate represents a much higher percentage of their revenue. So this increase of $17 million is necessary in order to maintain current services. That means to keep some of these smaller and more rural stations alive. Again, keep in mind, these small stations don't have the great fundraising capabilities like some of the larger stations do, perhaps in Washington, D.C. and places like that where they can raise money. But if these small stations don't receive an amount which will enable them to cover the increased cost of operating expenses, then I think we should all be aware that the result would be that many of the smaller and rural stations would have to close. The stations in places like Alaska. I don't know in the offer's own state, I don't know if there are any in Arizona, but I know in some of the more rural states, these stations just simply would not have the wherewithal to continue to operate. When Congress reauthorized public broadcasting last year, we directed, and I quote, that they, quote, expand service to those not now being served by public radio or television each year, end quote. Well, again, that costs some money. But it was the intention of Congress to broaden the public broadcasting, to get it into areas that had not been served. And so it doesn't seem fair that after we have directed them to do that 1 year, that now we turn around and say, however, we're going to cut your money. and not allow the additional funds to be used to do this. The already existing stations will pay the price if funding is not increased over last year's level. So that's really what we're about here, is fulfilling the mandate that this Congress went on record last year with, and that was to expand public broadcasting in those areas that are not served. And again, part of the money, as I pointed out, $10 million on the Ready to Learn program, a very important program that the Senator from Mississippi is very interested in and spoke about. So again, if the goal is to close some small rural stations, or if we want to cancel or postpone the start of the Ready to Learn program, if we want to mandate that public broadcasting do certain things and then say, however, we're not going to give you any money to do it, then obviously I think you should support the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. But again, if we want to fulfill the mandate of public broadcasting and get the Ready to Learn program going and make sure that it fulfills its congressional mandate, then I submit that the $27 million is needed to ensure that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is able to meet the mandate of Congress. I would reserve the balance of the time for the manager of the bill.
Mr. President,
Senator from Hawaii.
I ask unanimous consent that my prepared remarks be made part of the record as though presented in person.
Without objection, it is so ordered. Who yields time?
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. President, I note the presence of the Senator from Massachusetts. I don't think the Senator from Hawaii has much time left. I'd be glad to yield to him time if he would like to use it.
How much time do I have?
Senator from
Just 2 minutes if the Senator would be.
I yield 4 minutes to the Senator from Massachusetts.
Senator from Massachusetts
I think,
is recognized for 4 minutes. Mr. Kennedy.
The Senator from Arizona. Mr. President, I want to just address one program which has been referred to by the Senator from Iowa and also the Senator from Mississippi, and that are the provisions in here in terms of children's television programming. I think many of us have been concerned over a long period of time how to try to reduce both violence on television and also to encourage the networks to devote to more resources to the development of children's programming. And what we have found out after a very considerable period of time, just in terms of all those that have really been the most constructive and positive in developing children's programming, particularly targeted to the children at the earliest paths of educational experience from the Head Start programs into early education, that the opportunity to impact these children which are watching so much time on television is really an important and useful educational opportunity. And particularly of those neediest children who don't have the kind of parental supervision or other kinds of activities that can have a positive impact. And so I say that it's been a pleasure to work with the Senator from Mississippi on a number of different Star Schools programs, which the Senator from Iowa and other members have been interested in. And I think any of us who have seen that program in action, where you look at the number of children in rural areas and underserved areas that are working in areas of complexity in terms of educational experience, particularly as a time when there's been limited resources in many of these school districts. And still you have very talented individuals in some instances that benefit from continuing educational opportunities. This program was really focused and developed as an opportunity to strengthen the children at the earliest time of their educational experience, and is really consistent both with President Bush and President Clinton's hope and the governor's hope, and that is school readiness and permitting the maximum opportunity for children to benefit of this program, and to be able to develop the programs that then would be selected on a competitive basis by the corporation. So I want to just indicate that I think this is a very modest program, but one I think that can be useful and helpful in terms of children at the earliest age. I thank my colleague from Arizona for yielding the time on this to make a brief comment.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arizona, Mr. McCain is
I ask
recognized.
unanimous consent that Senator Mack be added as a co-sponsor of the amendment.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. President, I had a request for time from the senator from Texas, who I hope is on his way over here, and Senator Graham, and I hope that I also understand that leadership was not interested in a vote before 7 o'clock, so in the absence of that, I will suggest the absence of quorum and that the time run concurrently from both times.
Senator from Arizona, just the absence of quorum.
I can't find it. He's over on the house side somewhere.
Without objection, the time will be divided equally. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
This amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to have a sufficient second.
Mr. President, I have no further requests for time on this side. I yield back the balance of my time.
Senator from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. The senator from Hawaii has 2 minutes and 37 seconds. The question occurs on amendment by Senator from Arizona. The ayes and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Biden. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond. Mr. Boren. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Bradley. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Brown. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bumpers, Mr. Burns, Mr. Byrd, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Chafee, Mr. Coates, Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cohen, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coverdale, Mr. Craig, Mr. D'Amato, Mr. Danforth, Mr. Daschle, Mr. DeConcini, Mr. Dodd, Mr. Dole, Mr. Domenici, Mr. Dorgan, Mr. Durenberger, Mr. Exon, Mr. Faircloth, Mr. Feingold, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Ford, Mr. Glenn, Mr. Gorton, Mr. Graham of Florida, Mr. Graham of Texas, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Gregg, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Hatfield, Mr. Heflin, Mr. Helms, Mr. Hollings, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Jeffords, Mr. Johnston, Mrs. Cassabaum, Mr. Kempthorne, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kerry of Nebraska, Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts, Mr. Cole, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lott, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Mack, Mr. Matthews, Mr. McCain, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Metzenbaum, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mosley Braun, Mr. Moynihan, Mr. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nichols, Mr. Nunn, Mr. Packwood, Mr. Pell, Mr. Pressler, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed, Mr. Regal, Mr. Robb, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Roth, Mr. Sarbanes, Mr. Shelby, Mr. Simon, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Smith, Mr. Spector, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Thurmond, Mr. Wallop, Mr. Warner, Mr. Wellstone, Mr. Wofford, Senators voting in the affirmative: Coates, Graham of Texas, Hatch, McCain, and Nichols. Mr. Coverdale. Mr. Coverdale, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Bryan, Burns, Byrd, Cochran, Exon, Gorton, Harkin, Inouye, Kennedy, Murray, and Stevens. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, no. Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, Aye. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, aye. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts, no. Mr. Hollings. Mr. Hollings, no. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska, no. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Chafee, no. Mr. Daschle. Mr. Daschle, no. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Helms. Mr. Helms, aye. Mr. Sasser. Mr. Sasser, no. Mr. Matthews. Mr. Matthews, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Lott. Mr. Lott, aye. Mr. Wallop. Mr. Wallop, aye.
You got me, yes.
Mr. Simon. Mr. Simon, no. Mr. Glenn. Mr. Glenn, no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Mack. Mr. Mack, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dodd, no. Mr. Thurman. Mr. Thurman, no. Mr. Danforth. Mr. Danforth, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Breaux, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Graham of Florida. Mr. Graham of Florida, no. Mr. Faircloth. Mr. Faircloth, aye. Mr. Johnston. Mr. Johnston, no. Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford, no. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Roth. Mr. Roth, no. Mr. Hatfield. Mr. Hatfield, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Wellstone, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Jeffords, no. Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, no. Mr. Durenberger. Mr. Durenberger, no. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Moynihan, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Pell. Mr. Pell, no. Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen, aye. Mr. Bradley. Mr. Bradley, aye. Mr. Pressler. Mr. Pressler, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Murkowski, no. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, no. Mr. Regal. Mr. Regal, no. Mr. Heflin. Mr. Heflin, no. Ms. Mosley Braun. Ms. Mosley Braun, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. DeConcini. Mr. DeConcini, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. D'Amato, no. Mr. Robb. Mr. Robb, no. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Dorgan, aye. Mr. Spector. Mr. Spector, no. Mr. Metzenbaum. Mr. Metzenbaum, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Dole. Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Domenici, aye. Mr. Bumpers. Mr. Bumpers, no. Mr. Domenici, no. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn, no. Mr. Wofford. Mr. Wofford, no. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, no. Mr. Boren. Mr. Boren, no. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Packwood. Mr. Packwood, no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, no. Mr. Kempthorne. Mr. Kempthorne, no. Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, no.
Are there any other senators wishing to vote? If not, the ayes are 25, the nays are 72. The amendment is not agreed to. The amendment is not agreed to.
Excuse me, no one moved to reconsider.
Move to lay it on the table. Without objection,
Madam,
the amendment is not agreed to. And the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Madam President,
Majority Leader.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following be the only floor amendments remaining in order to H.R. 2518, the Labor HHS Appropriations Bill, that they be subject to relevant second-degree amendments if applicable, and that any amendment not offered by noon tomorrow shall no longer be in order. And the amendments listed are an amendment by Senator Helms regarding Medicaid, an amendment by Senator Helms regarding Social Security, an amendment by Senator Helms that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Helms that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Graham of Texas that is relevant, an amendment by Senator D'Amato regarding civil rights, an amendment by Senator Brown that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Brown that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Gregg that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Specter that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Hatfield that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Metzenbaum that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Metzenbaum that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Kennedy that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Biden regarding drugs, an amendment by Senator Byrd that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Murray that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Murray that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Murray that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Harkin that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Harkin that is relevant, an amendment by Senator Harkin in the nature of a manager's amendment.
Is there objection? If not, so ordered.
Madam President,
Majority Leader.
I modify my request by making clear that the manager's amendment by Senator Harkin is in the plural, manager's amendments. There may be more than one such.
Without objection.
Right. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President,
Be in order. Majority Leader.
the managers have advised me that they are prepared to remain in session this evening to consider and debate any amendment which any senator wishes to offer from among those on the list just incorporated into the agreement just approved. When we complete action this evening, we will recess until tomorrow morning, and we'll be back on this bill at 9:30 tomorrow morning. So a senator who chooses not to offer his or her amendment this evening would have to do so between 9:30 and noon, and thereby, of course, run the risk of not being able to get the amendment up by noon. So if any senator wishes to offer an amendment, any senator may remain here. The manager will stay here as long as it takes to consider these amendments. So I want to make clear that the objective of this is not to foreclose any senator, but merely to bring this bill to a conclusion in a circumstance which gives every senator full opportunity to debate the measure and to offer an amendment. And so any senator who wants to offer an amendment who's on the list can stay here. The manager will stay. There will be no further roll call votes this evening, and we'll complete action on this bill tomorrow and then proceed to one of the other appropriations bills. I thank my colleagues for their cooperation, the Republican leader and the Senator Harkins and Inspector. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
What a day for you. Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that a statement be included in the record by Senator Hatfield as if read in full.
Without objection.
And I further ask that a statement by Senator Domenici be included in the record as if read in full.
Without objection.
And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, Senator Spector and I are here to either accept or debate any amendments that any senators have. The list was read. It was agreed to. However, I don't think that Senator Spector wants to sit here all night. He can speak for himself. I know I don't.
Madam President, I do want to sit here all night.
I would just say, Madam President, that if any senators or the staff are listening who have the agreed-upon amendments, if they're on that list, say we sit here 15 minutes? You have 15 minutes?
Madam President, I concur with what Senator Harkinson said, and we think that 15 minutes would be a reasonable time. If any senator wishes to come over to offer an amendment, we would be delighted to proceed with the bill. And in the absence of any such senator, and I see none on the floor now, and the odds are substantial that we will not have any, that we would permit the staff and all participants here to return to their other activities, noting that it's 7:30 p.m.
So we'll be here about 15 minutes. And
I see unanimous consent evidenced by all the staff members.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.